Comincerò, lasciatemelo fare per titoli,
I would
perché
like to start by titles.
specialista, non sono uno
I am not an
storico,
expert, I am not a historian, but actually
propongo.
I'm going to start by making reference to the historical link between camps as an experiment in a colonial conquer period in the cases of South Africa, Namibia and Cuba, and in Europe, not only in Germany during the first part of the 20th century and the Second World War. In Italy it was with the Libyan War, which between 1911 and 1912 actually we used confinement camps, and this well before the fascist regime would send its political opponents there. There were places like Lipari and Ustica where the first internment camps for Ethiopian and Eritrean internees were used. And these camps were then used after the war as collection centers for undesired foreigners waiting for them to come back to home. This same project was also used here in Fossoli, as evidenced by the investigations of Costantino Di Sante. Post-colonial researchers also agree on the fact. So as I said, post-colonial researchers also agree on the fact that the extermination of the Jews represented a change of paradigm compared to the forms of confinement and internment preceding it. In order to understand its characteristics, it's important to, in a way, view the Nazi fascist transit camp within a broader perspective. Today's camps are not the camps that we had in the past, as recently wrote by Georges de Dubernon. But they're still camps. Their same structure is the result of a long history. And also on other occasions in the past, this history basically started with very simple detainment procedures. I'm going to contextualize my contribution within the framework of a post-colonial city in which the survival of old imperial projects are to be framed within the European and global scenario. As Didier Huberman states, it is the camp form which is still used in the framework of migration areas like Misurata or Lampedusa or Calais or other areas, or in Northern Africa. Not to mention all the centers where migrants and foreigners, undesired foreigners, are accommodated at the borders of Europe, waiting to return their homes. These places might change. Sometimes they take the shape of a tent place, of a hotspot, of a jail, an island, or, for example, a large set of containers. But still, we're talking about places which are characterized by common types and common functions, and something similar has also been mentioned by Professor Gordon before. These areas are often to be found near ports or borders or motorway junctions where you have the army focusing on them. They generate conflicts between the various parts of the diaspora. You have migrants, associations of volunteers, and they are places in which you have to find a specific form of life. Both of those accommodating them and those who administer them. The French anthropologist Michel Ager, at the Call of Altitude in Paris, suggested to define a camp any general definition, any general reality which is associated with the immobility of people in movement.
Come tenterò di dimostrare allora, nella genealogia di
So,
questa forma
in the
contemporanea
genealogy of this
di
contemporary form of mobilization,
titolo anche le
one
considerazioni
can
di Frantz Fanon sulla
also include Frantz Fanon's considerations on colonial cities.
considerazioni che potremmo
So
sviluppare
these
a partire dal
considerations might
1954.
start from 1954. In an attempt to draw a lesson from the defeat in Indochina, the French army restructured the Algerian territory based on the most pressing needs of military control.
Bisogna evitare qualunque contatto
It is necessary to avoid any contact between civilians and the rebels. We should favor a repression logistics, and we should set up centers for the accommodation, for the mass accommodation of population. So the people who were sent away from their home, farmers were sent away from their homes, they were moved to the new villages, and we are talking about hundreds and hundreds of camps surrounded by barbed wire, in which it is very difficult to distinguish between detainment, internment, and detention. Literature of the 19th century also helped us understand how the compromise between these two functions is not a last example of colonialism, but rather the very same reality of the colonialism. Frantz Fanon actually came to the same conclusion. He said that the indigenous are people who are surrounded in a secluded area. The apartheid is only but a way to divide the colonial world into different compartments. The new villages, therefore, only but intensify more usual use of the space, in which you have neighborhoods, in which you have quarters, in which the indigenous labor force finds its place in Europe. So you have the farmers group blocked at the borders of cities, around the borders of cities, who couldn't find anything to eat in the colonial system. This using Fanon's words. So we're talking about those people who, the growing population in the farms led to abandon the lands, who wander around the various cities hoping that sooner or later they will be allowed in. So this seems very contemporary, this is very similar. But at the time it was the Kalishbani, in which it is transformed, an area in which it is transformed. So 100,000 individuals secluded in a surrounded place. As Fanon writes, the European cities are not a prolongment of the autochthonous city. The colonists are not among the indigenous, but they sort of organized the siege, and any attempt to come out of the siege basically contributes to organize the siege, and this applies to many other towns. So Fanon examines a lot of aspects of this siege, and the first one of them is the dialectics of the body of the world. In other words, the experience that individuals can make of their body in comparison to the environments that they wish to inhabit and that they wish to destroy. Actually, this dream for destruction is more critical, it's more articulated, more complex in the concept of Fanon. But I'm not going into the details of this. And it is here, as Fanon says, that the colonized receive an implicit order which acts in resonance with the form of camp defined by Haget. So that you have the order of remaining immovable, not to move, because any movement might result the movement of a culprit, and it might lead to the reaction of the guard. Fanon talks about some kind of a curse. You have this natural feeling of being culprit of the indigenous, and in another excerpt, he mentions the life of the metropolis, in which, as Sartre said, the destiny of man is sort of ignored. Fanon writes that in the colony, the natural interlocutor of the colonized is the gendarme, is the guard or the soldier. In capitalistic societies, instead, the religious or lay teachings and the creation of moral teachings that can be transmitted from father to son, or the fact that you have workers being rewarded for 50 years of work. So aesthetic forms of the respect for the given order create an atmosphere of subduedness, of subjectedness basically alleviate the task of soldiers. This would lead us astray from our topic, so I'm just hinting at this. But actually, this entails all the prerequisites of what I mentioned to be part of a resync to the aesthetic forms of the order itself. And the most contemporary terms, this can be seen as the relation between the contemporary proliferation of camps and politics for decoration. So Fanon believes that it is possible to generalize the colonial exception between vandalic acts, or for example North African types, or European ones, and all of these various forms might confirm the thesis of Georgia Gam, based on which one can look at the camp not so much as a historical fact, as an anomaly that belongs to the past, even if this can still be seen, but rather as the hidden matrix to the norms of the political space in which we still live. But today we are not interested in the political philosophy of the camps, but rather in their phenomenology. Donatella Di Cesare recently wrote that there are lots of political and philosophical unknowns that camps bring with themselves. And these unknowns, these questions have to be addressed in further investigations. Donatella Di Cesare namely says that there is still not yet a phenomenology of the life in camps or remarks on waiting there. Fanon's remarks help us address this phenomenology, especially concerning the case of those who are colonized, who find themselves inside a camp whose body is sort of left outside of the outer world. So you have to remain immovable, you don't have to move, and this highlights and exacerbates the external world. And that is why the colonized never try to, in a way, liberate themselves. They dream how to jump, they dream how to swim, because during the day these people have to be constantly on alert. And basically they suffer some kind of a perceptive secludedness. This scandal of violence lies here. The violence that leads to the decolonization process is the opposite of colonial violence. It is no ideological organized violence that is in comparison and vis-à-vis to ethical considerations. It's rather the epileptic violence of men who are with their shoulders at the wall, of feeling yourself always inside the precinct, inside a camp, and always trying to justify and give meaning to your survival. In order to understand the survival of these people, we should actually think about the meaning that Fanon gives to the activities carried out during the night, which act in resonance with the anthropological perspective of another fundamental research of those of the colonized. I'm referring to a book on American slaves by Rowick. Rowick edited an editing of interviews of former slaves and children of slaves, and actually this volume of his represents a series of interpretation, and his theses are following. Only by adapting the African culture to new circumstances could African slaves resist the plantations. And so from the evening to the morning they could survive slavery through boycotting, through escapes, by participating in civil, but also thanks to the most ordinary practices of cults and living an ordinary life. And actually this coincided with giving traditional forms of tools new functions. The most convincing pages that Rowan gives to this topic refer to the new functions which are attributed to the iron pot in the plantation, or the transmission of oral narratives in which there's always a variation compared to the weak person who is, however, very smart. So based on these indications, it is possible to see that also in Fanon's world, the survival of the subject is not entrusted only to, in a way, pass from violence towards the colony, towards violence towards the colonists, but rather these ways of survival during the night. So basically, this secludedness, this physical and perceptive secludedness, is indicated and described by Fanon also when it comes to its deviations, which in the historical perspective indicated by the topic, by the conference, can refer to the forms of transit to the process of decolonization. In the damned of the earth, the character resorts to dance, to a supernatural world, to other monstrous creatures. In the 5th year of the Algerian Revolution, we witnessed transformations apply into most tangible forms, or to the reorganization of parental structures of gender relations. In other words, we're talking about resources or cultural forms in which the transit gives a different form, a vital form, which aims at the abandonment of a physical place, which Fanon calls Europe. Quittons cette Europe. This is what he says to the people who are inside the camp. And that is because in the dialectics of the world, you always have a culture that cannot be hibernated. You have a historical content that can be found in the moving dialogue vis-à-vis the use of one's own body. There was an essay on the female veil, and this is the most direct relationship with the philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose lectures were followed in 1948, so 3 years after the phenomenology of perception. There are a number of experts in which this appears to be more evident. So the absence of the veil alters the body essence of the Algerian woman. So she has to invent new dimensions for her body, new ways of controlling her muscles. And the Algerians who enter the European cities as naked ones learns again how to deal with their bodies. So also the perception of their bodies are subject to transit. So you basically have a historical dynamism of the body, which is similar to the dynamism of the veil, as Fanon says. So at the beginning, the veil is an example of existence, and its social value is very high. So basically this depends on the separation between the genders, and also because the occupier wants to tear away the veil from Algeria, and then this happens during the revolution. In precise moments, the veil helps Algerian women to basically be part of the fight. So the critique by Hannah Arendt to Fanon is less convincing. And that is because the convincing logic in the war is not indifferent to the death of various individuals, but rather it talks about the subjective character of a body which is well structured, expressing itself in a new way vis-à-vis the world and the others. If violence allows the colonized things to become men again, that does not refer to the mystical experience of the species, but rather that refers to a form which basically becomes alive again, especially in the most idiomatic and phenomenological sense of perceiving itself. So basically, the body helps us learn about itself. So what Arendt says is right. It is the individual who suffers from the fight. We're not talking, however, about a generic individual, but rather we're talking about a group, a society of individuals who are secluded in their own individualism. The colonized, as Fanon said, who can bury themselves, will actually discover how false this theory. The forms of the liberation war will basically indicate a new form of vocabulary. So brother or sister are parts of are terms used by the bourgeoisie. And actually, thanks to a shared violence, certain individuals' business is everybody's business, because we will either be all saved or we will all die. So violence in Fanon means life overcoming the stagnation of death, and this death cannot have to deal only with its literary and biological meaning. This overcoming affects the mass because it is the colonized who have to continue actually acting as the colonized. In a world without divisions, in which you have men, individuals, one above the others, you have barracks, one above the other, with actually a city which is reduced to a group of blacks and niggers. And actually this explained the desire of a deportee to mimetize, to camouflage themselves in this world without divisions. The men, the individuals living in concentration camps tend to be absorbed by the mass, not only by suggestion, but for a number of reasons, because they are convinced of the fact that they can save themselves better. Being absorbed by the mass means that you are almost invisible, that you avoid the guards hitting at you. So you have the glimpse and the look of the colonizer, and you have the desire to wish. So basically, because of this, the colonized will be led by their own feelings and the enthusiasm for the collective fight. These are the words of Gillo Pontecorvo, who, together with Franco Solina, made reference to the works of Salon to shoot the Battle of Algeria. What formal solutions can represent this anthropological and historical friction? This is basically the problem that emerged for Gillo Pontecorvo when he started shooting the film, when you had three women of the National Liberation Front who basically wanted to place bombs. Pontecorvo was not convinced of the kind of communication, he was not convinced of the climate that would stem from that dialogue. Solinas described the scene on several occasions, but he was not convinced as well. So on the set, you had a very bad feeling characterized by improvisation, but then Pontecorvo basically remembered a sound, a Baba Salem, so the typical music of Arab beggars, which is very similar to heartbeat. So the music of Baba Salem resounded during the sets, during the shootings, and then represented the soundtrack in post-production, the post-production stage. And once again, it was that music which made the moment more dramatic. So it seems to me that the decision by Pontecorvo represents basically this good example of dialogue, and well represents the thoughts of Fanon. So choosing to use a traditional music as a symbol of heartbeat, so creating this link between history and the perception of the body, you have a link between the
in un processo di rifunzionalizzazione complessiva. Come hanno già scritto altri, lo schema storico-razziale
complexity. Fanon's initial framework is not produced discursively, but it is represented by the sedimented experiences of racism which make up for the body. So the body is basically the place in which you have a mute way of expression. So, to conclude, I think that it is exactly from this and from the evidence of a relationship with history and with space that we draw draw inspiration from, and especially that the analysis of several contexts might be analyzed, in which we still inherit the colonialistic aspect of it.